So we were going to do a quick intro to HeliCloud. I think most of you may have seen this last week anyway. HeliCloud is an AWS advanced consulting partner. We really only work on AWS as a cloud platform, but we're also a HashiCorp reseller and partner, and the only EMEA support partner for HashiCorp. So if you've not heard of HashiCorp, HashiCorp provide a range of tools for building infrastructure and systems. The primary one is Terraform and Vault. Those are the main ones that we use. We've got a range of people in HeliCloud who are certified on the AWS platform, and we are cloud born and bred. We haven't been going for very long, but we're growing quickly, and hopefully you'll get some gist of that as we go through the presentation. So I'd like to say welcome and thank you for taking the time to participate in this event. Will's already welcomed you in. This is a follow-up event to the one we ran last week, and if you were not able to join us on the last one, I hope that today's session will still be useful to you. So what I intend to do over the course of the next 20 minutes or so is to talk about the challenges you might face when doing a review, and also look at some of the statistics we see when we as HeliCloud do reviews. We'll look at some examples of well-architected systems and leave you finally with some thoughts on how to proceed and where to go next. First, though, just a quick refresher from last week on the 5 pillars of the well-architected framework. You will remember that to make the framework more structured, it's divided into these 5 pillars, which are security, reliability, performance, efficiency, cost optimization, operational excellence, and each of these pillars is underpinned by a set of design principles, and overall there's also a set of design principles governing the whole well-architected framework. And the idea is that you apply these across all aspects of your AWS system design. Now that we've had a look at those, let's just talk about doing reviews against the well-architected framework itself. We previously talked about the online tool which AWS provides. If you want to conduct your own well-architected review, then you'll need to use this. And we also looked at some of the other resources that are available to you. Excuse me, which I've outlined here. So if you go to the white papers, you'll get details about the well-architected framework. At the end, I will put it up some more resources for you to follow. Using the online tool is a great idea, but it does pose some challenges, particularly if you're trying to use this on your own. And so AWS actually recommends using a partner like HeliCloud to assist you through the process. The biggest challenges you'll face in running the review relate to the nature of the questions being fairly open-ended and the ability to understand the trade-offs that you may need to make between the different pillars and areas. Another issue that people frequently face is the relentless pace of innovation that AWS sets. In any given year, AWS introduces thousands of new features, services and updates. And finally, and possibly the most difficult aspect is doing remediation quickly and effectively. Interestingly, we've just come off a conversation with one of our previous customers who want us to do a little bit more work for them. We engineered a system in AWS for them about 3 years ago. And now going back and looking at that system, we look at it and we say, well, if we were in re-engineering that system now, we would do it in a completely different way, because there's so many new AWS services that have been introduced that we can actually build a system more effectively, more quickly, and give them a better outcome. So that for me, that was quite interesting, that it shows that change of pace of innovation that AWS has. So let's look at some of the statistics we see from reviews before moving on any further. To give you some context, over the past 3 years, we've run 39 official well-architected reviews. Now, these exclude the well-architected reviews which we run as a standard part of our managed services program. In all, 9 consultants have led or participated in these reviews. And although we've been conducting these reviews for 3 years, it's only in the past 12 months. That was good. It's only in the past 12 months that we've offered a service which includes remediation. And during this time, we've executed 76 days of remediation effort that addresses critical issues in customer workloads. Unfortunately, the remediation days are just popping up and disappearing. So that's strange. Anyway, so sensibly, when we conduct reviews, they're conducted and they're split into the 5 pillars. That makes a lot of sense. This means that we can present you some of the findings about what we typically see. And as you can see here, the 2 top pillars with issues are typically, well, they are security and reliability. And together they form over half of the issues that we discover. The other 3 pillars are evenly distributed, as you can see. And the interest, because we've got limited time today, I'm only going to delve into security and reliability because those are the ones that we see most often, and look at those in a little bit more detail. So let's look at security first. So here we see that the top 4 major issues are OS level protection, not having a clean room for incident response, minimal use of multi-factor authentication, and testing through game days. The reason that OS level protection is so high is because most workloads are still using a predominance of EC2 based compute, and organizations often don't have a well-defined mechanism for detecting upgrades in the underlying AMIs. They also don't have an automated way of hardening EC2 instances. We still see EC2 instances exposed to the public running with known vulnerabilities, although that's rare. The other thing you should do is have a clean room for handling security incidents. What this means is that you have a segregated part of your estate which has all the tools needed to do security incident work. It may be that you don't have it running all the time, but you could bundle all the tools that you need in an AMI and then use Terraform or CloudFormation to create a separate isolated stack for it and deal with security incidents as they occur. For MFA, best practice says that usernames and passwords aren't enough. You need to have defense in depth with multi-factor authentication. But we quite frequently see that this has been used and adopted in a very sporadic fashion with only some accounts and users being protected by MFA. The notion of game days is great, but essentially what this means is that you should simulate security events and then respond to the incident. Clearly, the person or team simulating it should be different to the team handling the event. Then you assess what happened. Was your approach well defined? If not, define it and otherwise improve it. Let's look at reliability now. Here we see a much more even distribution of the top 4 issues. The top recommendation arising is to regularly test for failures. What this means is injecting failure either through game days, for example, or using the notorious chaos monkey. Create yourself a duplicate environment, have someone break something, but don't let them tell you what that is, and then try and investigate what that break is, fix it, have a debrief on what had made the response better. We also often see that clients don't have a defined disaster recovery strategy. It's important to have one. We don't tell you what that should be, just that you should have one, and most importantly, test it. Although, of course, we'll be quite happy to work with you to define that strategy in the first place. On service limits, AWS implements service limits for a range of different reasons, but primarily to ensure you don't overspend. However, if you don't keep track of your usage, then you may hit those limits and find that you have to spend several hours of downtime while you troubleshoot the problem and have AWS support raise your limits. There are various ways of dealing with this, but as always with AWS, you want to find an automated solution to this problem. Frequently, we also find that clients don't always adapt their system to changes in demand. The easiest way to do this in a reliable and automated fashion on AWS is to use auto-scaling, preferably across availability zones. But bear in mind that in some cases your architecture may not support horizontal scaling using auto-scaling. Okay, so I've taken you through some of the issues that we find when we look at reviews. It's a good time to talk briefly about how we conduct a review. The review is just the beginning of a three-stage process which culminates in hopefully an AWS credit to your account after remediation is complete. There is some small print around this offer and we'll touch on that later, but for now we're going to focus on the review process itself. As you would expect, we review against the 5 pillars and we use the AWS online tool. This is mandatory in order for you to get your credit and forms part of the discovery and data collection that you see here. In order to avoid overstretch and to maintain scope, the well-architected review is conducted against a single workload. And this is important for a number of reasons, not least of which is that you have, if you have multiple workloads, they may perform differently and exhibit different characteristics against the review process. Once the review is complete, our consultant will take some time reviewing the results in detail and producing 2 deliverables for you, a scorecard and an action plan. The scorecard is used as a review and discussion tool, whereas the action plan is a result of an agreed set of remediation actions arising out of that discussion. The remediation itself, number 4 that you see here, is a very distinct step and not considered part of the review, but is part of the HeliCloud well-architected review package offering. These packaged offerings come in 2 forms, basic and advanced, as you can see here. The basic is for customers whose AWS spend is currently under $5,000 a month, whereas the advanced review is for those customers who have consumption in excess of $5,000 but less than $20,000 a month. The process is the same, but because of the complexity of larger workloads, each step needs to be longer. You may be asking what the outputs look like from such a review. Well, once we complete the review, you get a scorecard and action plan, and these are graded into 4 categories. These are high to low risk items and a long-term objective grade. Obviously, the high risk are the most important, and these should be addressed in 4 weeks or less typically, and are the ones that generally we cover in the remediation work that we provide. All the items are graded, and then we present these to you as a summary. The summary is obviously, again, as you'd expect, based on the pillars, and this is an example from a real review where you can see that the 2 main pillars of concern were security and cost optimization. This summary is useful in giving you an idea of where most of your remediation effort is going to be spent, and indeed where you have most risk. Behind each of these pillars is much more detail, so let's take a look at the security pillar as an example of this. In this slide, you can see an abridged copy of a real review. This doesn't have all of the items that were found, but it's a subset of the high-risk issues identified. Of course, these are specific to the workload that was under review at the time, so there isn't much point going into the detail specifically, as if you do a review for yourselves, your critical issues are going to be different. So instead, rather than focusing on this, what I'd like to do is take a look at a couple of examples of well-architected systems and see where the well-architected framework fits into those examples. So let's look at some examples. As you remember from the statistics, The principal area we find fault with is security. So it won't come as a surprise that in many cases there is a lot of work to be done to ensure accounts are properly separated and configured. So one of the recommendations that we see coming out of reviews, at least some reviews, is the implementation of a landing zone. A landing zone is structured around AWS organizational units that you can see here on the top right, which are then further segregated into a number of separate accounts. By laying the foundations for strong identity management and implementing according to the principle of least privilege, we enforce separation of duties with appropriate authorization for each interaction with your AWS resources. Broadly speaking, the landing zone provides a build across 5 different areas, and these are account setup, identity and access management, security and governance, networking, and account vending. It's important to stress at this point that such major work is not covered under our remediation days, but would need to be a project in its own right. Now, clearly, if you're starting from a zero footprint in AWS, then you should be building a landing zone from the outset, as a landing zone embodies many of the general design principles and the security design principles of the well-architected framework. We'll take one more example. This one is a reference architecture from AWS for a HIPAA compliant system. HIPAA is a security framework for the health sector and is very much US centric, but I decided to use this one as it embodies some excellent examples. The architecture supports the well-architected framework best practices for high availability and security through a range of characteristics, including a multi-AZ architecture that you can see here, intended for high availability, isolation of instances between public and private subnets, security groups limiting access to only necessary services, network access control lists to filter traffic into subnets, acting as an additional layer of network security, a secured bastion host. This instance facilitates restricted login access for system administrator actions, S3 buckets with security features enabled for logging, archiving, and application data, and implementation of proper load balancing and auto scaling capabilities. And the list actually continues for this architecture, but you get the general idea that you see here. Previously, we just looked at landing zones, and following best practice, this architecture would be deployed into a well-architected landing zone. But it's interesting that even with this architecture, we can see some areas for improvement. For instance, by implementing this architecture through infrastructure as code using Terraform, it would be possible to have the whole architecture be immutable, and hence we'd remove the need for a bastion host at all. So during this session, we've looked at the statistics that we see for issues arising out of well-architected reviews and the challenges that you might face when conducting your own review. We've looked at how HeliCloud runs its own well-architected review and remediation engagements, and we've looked at some examples of well-architected systems. So I'm going to stop here on the resources, and I'm going to hand back to Walter to close out the session. Yes. And then we'll go to we'll go to questions after that.
Small update, my child is still alive and he just came to ask me really nicely if I wanted to have live for those interested. Thank you, Carlos, that was quite interesting. I like practical examples, and I like the practical the statistics from the reviews we've done. I'll give a small summary, and after that we'll do questions. If you have questions, you can already start typing them in the Q&A box. so that we can answer them. Unfortunately, we cannot give anyone a microphone, so you can start adding them in the Q&A box, and either Will will respond in chat, or we will go through the ones that could use a little bit more talking. As Carlos mentioned in his talk, we have these well-architected review packages, and basically, in order to determine which package is best for each customer, we take the monthly spend, which you see in the top row, as the proxy for how much there is to review on a workload. So this is for a workload, not necessarily for your whole infrastructure. For some of you, a workload is their whole infrastructure. If you're running like a SaaS application or whatever, then most likely that's just a single workload. But if you're running a more like an enterprise environment, then you probably have up to hundreds or thousands of workloads, and this is per each workload. Carlos, I see you. Yes.
Sorry.
It's all right.
Apologies.
And so, depending on your monthly spend, we decide which one of the packages you need. The review itself doesn't necessarily change, just that we need a little bit more time into the architecture deep dive and doing the review if it's a more advanced workload. And for us, important, the remediation is a different length, simply because a larger workload will likely have more things coming out, findings coming out of it. And in order to get the $5,000 credit from AWS, at the end of everything, you need to show to AWS, or we need to show to AWS, it's something we take care of for you actually, that at least 25% of the critical issues have been addressed. Simply because the whole point of these well-architected reviews is not just to know what the problems are, but also to make a real effort into making less of these problems. If you're interested, please contact any of us. We're here and happy to help. The last thing I want to do before we go to the actual Q&A, Carlos, can you please go to the next slide? Yeah, we have a couple more events coming up. In May, we haven't announced the dates yet, but we will send you an email when we have the specific dates for these. And if you're interested in these topics, then we'd very much like to invite you for those webinars. They will be similar style like this. We like short bursts of valuable knowledge, so that you can really get the most value out of it. That was mostly it. Thanks, Will, for introduction. Carlos, for the ad hoc takeover of my of my situation, as well as, of course, the webinar itself. And then we'll have some time for questions.
I think we've got one in the box already. Do you want me to read it out and you can answer me, or? So the question is, if creating a greenfield architecture with Hello Cloud, would a well architecture like framework review be performed after some months of workloads running on a new platform?
Yeah, so normally the way we do this, so well-architected reviews for each workload can be done every 6 months. And the reason for this is that you need to realize that when you have a workload running on AWS, if you're not yet used to AWS, it's very much a living organism. So once a workload is up and running, it doesn't stop changing. The infrastructure changes regularly around it. And so whether you run it yourself or we run it for you, part of our managed service also includes doing these well-architected reviews on our own stuff. The same goes for greenfield architectures that you create. Doing a well-architected review after a few months is a really good way to make sure that not just what we did, but also what you did and what the whole design was, that was actually in a best practices way. And especially if it's a smaller architecture, is very much recommended, because you get the credits for relatively small amounts of work, because most likely the remediation will be very little, especially if you let us build the architecture as well. Because we were a well-architected review partner, we know very well how to build architectures that are compliant with this this kind of setup.
That's great. Am I also right in thinking that for people starting out with AWS, we recommend that they kind of go with a landing zone? Was that something that Carlos discussed?
Yeah, I mean, in general, AWS is like a box of Legos, right? So the way I see it is, somebody comes to your office, takes a giant box of Legos, turns them over on your desk, and says, "And now you can build everything." Can you do this yourself? Or can you build a car out of it yourself? Yes, you absolutely can. However, there are quite a few bits and pieces that you need to be thinking about when you're building that car, and that's where we come in. And that's also where this landing zone comes in. If the foundation of your of whatever it is you're building is not solid, then you're going to have lots of nightmares later on. A very simple example of that is thinking about your network design. If you make assumptions in your VPC architecture early on, you will be very sorry later on if those assumptions turn out to be incorrect. So it's very important to think about these things in advance. And a landing zone is it's an AWS concept of which we have built an implementation in Terraform and AWS. That kind of makes sure that you're set up right from the basics.
Super. Don't think, I'm going back through it, I don't think we have any more questions at the moment. Obviously, there's a lot of concern over your son, who is fine.
Yes.
What you didn't see is that my kids came in the interim and were ushered out again, and they were pressing the doorbell as well. They were outside pressing the doorbell. Fun.
Excellent.
Answered the door whilst this was on and said, "What do you want?" "Oh, we're just seeing if you're in." Thank you.
It's all good. Okay, thank you very much then, and we hope to hear from you. We'll send out the recording as well as a copy of the presentation, and it will also be on YouTube soon.
Super. Well,
Thanks, Walter.
Thanks, Carlos. Well,
Thanks, Will.
Bye.
Have a great day, everyone.